Welcome back, Archaeophiles. In the last video, I spoke about symbols in the coronation of the British Monarchy. I talked about the Coinor, Lamprey Pies, and the anointment of King Charles III. So if you haven't watched part 1 on this topic, then pause this video and give it a watch first. Don't worry, I'll wait. Good? Great. So, as I said in part 1, most objects of the monarchy were destroyed during the Civil War and the Commonwealth period. The anointing spoon might be the oldest royal item to survive the woke Republican mobs, but there's another object that was left intact during this period too, and it's been a part of every coronation for longer than the anointing spoon has. In the late 1200s, a throne was commissioned by King Edward I, or this guy in that movie with that anti-Semite. The Coronation Chair, or St. Edward's Chair, again named after Edward the Confessor, was built between 1297 and 1300 by the carpenter Walter of Durham. And the first time that we do know for certain that it was used in a coronation was for Henry IV in 1399. And over the years, it's changed, having a wooden platform placed on it, gilded lions made into the legs in the 1500s, and those were then replaced about 200 years later. And over time, the gilded images and glasswork of plants and animals that had been placed into the chair have either degraded or just disappeared. Conservator Christopher Leslie called it a unique work of art and the oldest surviving piece of furniture still used for its original purpose. And another unique aspect of this chair is that, unlike other parts of the coronation, people outside of the royal family have been widely allowed access to it. Tourists were able, for a small fee of course, to actually sit in the chair for a time. And a number of people have carved their names into the wood itself or just kind of taken bits of the throne back home with them. And this would be like people being allowed to take a photo op with the crown jewels on their heads. Maybe pocket the Koinur. It's just something that's really unexpected for an item that's just steeped in centuries of elite tradition. The common man has been able to touch butts with a long line of monarchs, and that, my friends, is what we call equality. This chair has only left Westminster Abbey twice since it was installed there. Once for the Second World War, so it didn't, get blown up. And today, it's a little bit more protected from tourists and the elements than it had been previously. And Sir George Gilbert Scott, the architect who built Prince Albert's Memorial, described the coronation chair as a magnificent piece of decoration, but sadly mutilated. This royal seat has gone through a lot, but it still needed to be in tip-top shape for His Majesty's flat, bony ass. And so restoration of the royal dumper sling began in late 2022 and finished just in time for the coronation itself. The setting and resetting process of the wood for the chair was absolutely painstaking. Each time it was moved, it would have to be reset, with monitoring how each piece, each board settled, resettled, and the gilding had to be ensured that it would stay in place, or at least if it would fall off, that it wouldn't make more damage in the process of doing so. So it was a massive amount of restoration work that went into this incredibly storied piece of furniture. But even after all that conservation work, the chair wasn't complete yet. Edward didn't have this chair built for his own coronation. That actually took place about 20 years earlier in 1274, but he had it built for what scholars might consider a bit of a dick move. So one of Edward's bynames alongside Longshanks, because of his height, was Scotorum Malleus, the Hammer of the Scots. But before he actually did anything to do with hammering Scots, he actually had a very long and decorated military career. As a prince, his diplomatic and military ability, his flexibility, and his clear ambitions were enough to cause his own father to worry that Edward would try to overthrow him. But this didn't actually happen, and Edward became a very fierce defender of his father's rule when he took to aggressive negotiations against nobles who were trying to pressure the crown into making reforms. His strategy was to sack Gloucester, which was held by one of those lords. So after the 3 years Barons' War, Edward then went on to launch a crusade against the Mamluks. Edward carried out a series of raids, repelled the Sultan's army at Acre, and even convinced the Mongols to give him their military support. Yeah, he brought the Mongols into the Crusades. After destroying the Mamluk fleet that tried to capture Cyprus, Edward negotiated a decade-long truce. And while ensuring that the truce would hold, somebody sent an assassin to deal with the English prince. Now, history isn't certain who, but some sources say that it might have been the Mamluk Sultan or the leader of the Shishin order himself who sent the blade, but we don't know. Famously, though, Edward was the one who did the killing that day, but he was wounded in the arm and, according to some of the stories, was poisoned. His wife, Eleanor, was said to have sucked the poison out from the wound. There's actually been a lot of art that's commemorating that act of wifely devotion to Edward. And while recovering from his wound, Edward received the message of the death of his son, John, and his father, the king. So he returned to establish his long-awaited rule. Early in his reign, Edward invaded Wales to put people down who he saw as being uncooperative vassals and to put them in line. But ultimately he settled for conquering it in 1283. He built castles to fortify New English holdings and decorated them all with images of King Arthur, who was a very, very Welsh hero at the time. The people of Wales viewed Arthur as a messianic figure in their resistances against the Angles, the Saxons, the English, the Normans. And the author of the Anglo-Norman text, The Description of England, wrote that the Welsh, openly, they go about saying that in the end they will have it all. By means of Arthur, they will have it back. They will call it Britain again. Edward knew the power that Arthur had to the Welsh and the hopes that they would be free through him and once again be the rulers of Britain. By co-opting Arthur, Edward sent a strong message. I'm your Arthur now. Meanwhile, in Scotland, there was a really different picture. Unlike the Welsh, who Edward saw as vassals who were lacking in paying him proper and financial respects, England and Scotland had somewhat equal relations under feudal laws of the time. Now, King Alexander III paid homage to Edward in 1278, but he only did that for lands that he held within England itself. In his own words, he wrote, I become your man for the lands I hold of you in the kingdom of England, for which I owe homage, saving my kingdom. Alexander was also Edward's brother-in-law, so the ties of the two kingdoms were relatively close. They were good enough terms that Edward was actually entrusted with helping Scotland avoid a civil war. Now, Alexander died in 1286, leaving his only living descendant, 3-year-old granddaughter, Margaret of Norway, as the designated queen. The situation was breaking down pretty quickly, and Margaret's safety was not guaranteed whatsoever. So the Treaty of Bergen was signed, where the Kingdom of England would ensure the independence of Scotland, the safe assent of Margaret, and that these two kingdoms would continue to have close ties by marriage. Margaret would marry Edward's equally prepubescent child. And yeah, that probably would have gone a very long way to solve this problem, to stabilize everything. But there's just one small problem. On her journey from Norway to Scotland in 1290 to be crowned queen, Margaret got sick and died on her arrival to Orkney. So Scotland had a full-blown succession crisis on its hands. Historians from the 1700s have called this the Great Cause. Over a dozen nobles, not just in Scotland, all forwarded a claim to their right to become the new monarch of Scotland. And things were teetering on getting real bloody real quick. The two main claimants finally shook out. That's John Balliol and Robert de Bruce. These men started making alliances and raising armies. Rather than decision by pokey stabby, the Guardians of Scotland, who'd served as the regents during this time, they initiated an audit of these two men's claims and invited Edward to serve as an observer and an administrator to this legal dispute. Of the auditors, there were 104 people selected. Balliol and de Bruce each nominated 40 individuals onto this panel, and to try and keep things balanced, Edward was chosen to then select 24 senior members of the Scottish community at large. Edward was also handed temporary stewardship of the kingdom until this final legal decision could be made. In November of 1292, that finally came. They chose Balliol. There was just one problem. Edward didn't have any intention of giving up the power that he had been given. So Scotland had been previously vassal of England over the years, but during Edward's reign, by that time, there was no real strong legal argument to make that be the case anymore. Now, he tried to change that by working vassalage into the conditions of his role as an administrator for the succession, but that issue was sidestepped by the Guardians of Scotland, who said that, that'd be something that only the King of Scotland could agree to make, and they couldn't make that choice. So, yeah, they moved past that in that way. Still, even as after Balliol was selected, Edward continued to hear Scottish court cases. One of them actually against Balliol himself. Now that Balliol agreed to be tried in an English court didn't go over well among the Scots who had just made him king. And he ultimately was stripped of his power, and a 12-person council was installed in his place, with him staying as king in 1296. Edward's attitude towards the Scottish rule became clear when he demanded that the Scottish sent soldiers in his new war against France. And I guess they did, just the opposite way that I think Edward wanted. They ended up making an alliance with France, which we call the Auld Alliance, and invaded Carlisle. Now, I took some time to talk about Edward's political and military background leading up to this point, because I just really, really wanted to stress that Edward was not somebody to fuck with. The attack failed, and Edward retaliated viciously. He sacked the city of Berwick-upon-Tweed, where the completely non-biased author of the mid-1400s Scottish text, the Scotic Chronicon, wrote that Edward spared no one, whatever the age or sex, and for 2 days streams of blood flowed from the bodies of the slain. Mills could be turned by the flow of their blood. Sure, an embellishment, but we do know that upwards to 17,000 out of 22,000 soldiers and civilians were slaughtered there. And Edward stayed in the city for a time to shore it up as a staging point for further invasions, but on the 5th of April of 1296, he received a letter from King John Balliol taunting him, saying, "O foolish knave, what folly he commits! If he will not come to us, we will go to him." Hell of a time to show some backbone there, buddy. Well, Edward came to them and completely crushed the Scottish army at Dunbar later that month. Edward stormed through Scotland, and most nobles surrendered just upon his arrival, with a few exceptions. Balliol fled several times, but surrendered in June and confessed to rebellion a few weeks later. On the 8th of July, he had his royal arms and outfit ripped from his body publicly, and from that we know him by the byname Túm Tebhard, the empty coat. Edward had won, and in a similar fashion as he did with Welsh traditions, he confiscated a powerful emblem of Scottish rulership, the Stone of Skun, or Enlliafel, the Stone of Destiny. The seat that Edward built was done after this victory over the Scots, and it was built so that way he could sit on the Stone of Destiny in a properly royal fashion. Sitting on the stone, or in some cases just standing on it, comes from a long Gallic tradition of stones and kingship. This one has a few histories and legends attached to it. As part of a series of stories in the medieval period that have sought to connect Great Britain with and Ireland to the Levant, some 4,000 kilometers or 2,500 miles away, one of the popular origin stories of the Stone of Destiny is that it's the very same stone in Genesis that the patriarch Jacob used as a pillow on the night that he received a vision from God. According to this, the stone was later spirited away to Egypt and then brought to Ireland by either a pharaoh's daughter named Scota, or the Milesians, who mythically invaded Ireland, or maybe even the prophet Jeremiah. From Ireland, the Stone of Destiny is said to have been taken by the legendary Gael king Fergus Mór to Argyll in Scotland, where he founded the Scottish kingdom of Dalriada sometime around 500 CE. Yeah, that's right. The Scots of Scotland are from Ireland. But I'll talk about that historic fact and the made-up connections between the islands and biblical or the classical world some other time. Now, the capital of Dalriada was a very large hill fort called Dunad in the Kilmartin Glen, and that area is just absolutely teeming with ancient stoneworks and monuments, and it's here in this landscape that we see another stone with a boar, some writing, and a footprint carved into it. And at this stone, as a part of the ascension of Gallic monarchs, they would place their foot into the carved out footprint to show their connection to the land, their dominance over it, and that the land itself accepted this as the state of being. This is a motif that we see back in Ireland too, which has its own stone of destiny that would roar when the rightful king placed their foot or sat on it. Now, all these stones are connected in some way, and it's been a matter of debate over, if the stone of destiny is the stone of destiny or just a stone of destiny. It's part of a much bigger issue between Scotland, Ireland, England, and the stone of destiny. Because, if the stone that Edward took is the same as the one that would roar for Irish kings, and it's been in Scotland from 500 to almost 1300, then what about the stone that roared for the last Irish High King, Brian Boru, in 1002? But, there's no political baggages to Irish kingship. Anyhow, the stone that Edward took, also called the Stone of Scone, gets its name from, where it was said to have been kept. The stone that we know is a 335 pound or 152 kilogram block of what's called old red sandstone, which geologically is probably from a quarry somewhere near Scone itself. And this bit of geological news and other factors that are plucked from legendary descriptions have led to, some people claiming that the Stone of Scone that was taken by Edward and used in every English coronation for the last several centuries is a fake. In one fashion or another over the centuries, this idea has popped up, what we call the Westminster Stone hypothesis. Most recently, it's entered into popular imagination thanks to the author Nigel Tranter. Tranter and others, they've maintained that the monks at the Abbey of Scone, rather than handing over the real stone to Edward, they just switched it out for a more locally sourced one that probably had been intended for some kind of building, but due to some issues was never actually used. So they just gave him that one instead. And supporters of this hypothesis contend that, this is an act of Scottish defiance and that the real stone was spirited away to the Hebrides into hiding, away from it falling into English hands. It's a trick that Edward and all the English monarchs have fallen for. Now, this story, it turns the humiliation of English controlling a powerful symbol of Scottish kingship and identity into one of deceiving, fooling, and humiliating the English over generations due to their own ignorance. It's a really strong message to send to anyone, to deny Edward and the English the satisfaction of ever being able to subjugate the Scots. And it's a fun story of inverting the display of dominance that the Coronation Chair depicts, but there are a lot of problems with the Westminster Stone hypothesis. Namely, why wouldn't the real stone have been taken out of hiding at any point after the Scottish won their independence? I mean, wouldn't making a big thing, carrying it out to coronate the monarchs of an independent Scotland be just sweet, sweet humiliation to the English. So why not? But over the centuries, that never happened. So what would be the point in even keeping the real stone and not using it publicly, which was its whole purpose? And even more, defenses that it doesn't match up with legendary accounts, that it isn't from Ireland or Palestine for that matter, isn't really good enough when there are other explanations. The easiest of that being that it was really important to make a coronation stone out of something local. Or, how would the entire symbol of a land accepting a ruler make any sense? It's, just so happened to get other stories attached onto it. Made up stories, I guess I need to say. And this is the simplest conclusion for us to come to, that the Stone of Scone is the Scottish Stone of Destiny. And regardless of dipping deeper into any of these arguments about origin or reality, it still does carry an image and strong symbolism of Scotland, which is the important bit to all of this. It was so important that in 1950, 4 university students from Glasgow, Ian Hamilton, Gavin Vernon, Alan Stewart, and Kay Matheson, each members of the Scottish Covenant Association, that's a group of people who advocated for home rule for Scotland, they broke into Westminster Abbey and repatriated the stone. In doing so, they accidentally broke it in half, and not so accidentally broke the Coronation Chair. The 4 activists stashed the stone in the English countryside before returning to Scotland just ahead of the UK government closing the English-Scottish border for the first time in around 4 centuries. And they waited for about 2 weeks before they were able to move again and take the stone over the Scottish border once more. The stone was recovered by the police in April of 1951, but only because they were tipped off by the 4. The location that they were given was Arbroath Abbey, where the Declaration of Scottish Independence was drafted in 1320. The police found the stone there with a Scottish flag draped over it. The students admitted to the theft, and the Stone of Destiny returned to Westminster in 1952. The Attorney General of England and Wales, Hartley Shawcross, spoke of the theft to Parliament, saying that the clandestine removal of the stone from Westminster Abbey and the manifest disregard for the sanctity of the Abbey were vulgar acts of vandalism which have caused great distress and offence both in England and Scotland. I do not think, however, that the public interest required criminal proceedings to be taken. In reality, the 4 had become heroes in Scotland and had birthed a new wave of Scottish nationalism, and the UK government was worried that their arrest might go over poorly with the Scottish. In the general election before the taking of the stone in 1950, the Scottish National Party had won less than 0.5% of the vote. The Conservative Party, the Tories, was incredibly popular in Scotland at the time, and Scottish Labour had stepped away from any stance of support for devolution or home rule. But the act that these 4 people took saw all of that change. The SNP began to grow in the 1960s, and so did Scottish nationalism. By 1996, the Stone of Scone was actually formally returned to Scotland and had been kept in Edinburgh Castle. The following year, in 97, Scotland voted to have a devolved parliament, taking control of their ability to make decisions for the Scottish people. And since 2007, the SNP, the Scottish National Party, has been the controlling party of that Scottish Parliament. In 2014, Scotland held an unsuccessful referendum for independence, with one of the main talking points being that an independent Scotland would likely not be allowed in the European Union. Awkward. But while the SNP underperformed in the 2017 election, it bounced back, and calls for a second referendum have not died. Even with the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon and the new leadership of Humza Yousaf, the question of Scottish independence isn't one that's going away anytime soon, despite a UK court declaring that another referendum would be illegal. I'm sure that none of that will be an issue for the UK and the monarchy in the future. It's not like Alex Salmond, the First Minister of Scotland from 2007 to 2014, called on the Scottish government to have a physical standoff to prevent the UK government from taking the Stone of Scone for the coronation, unless it recognized the right to another referendum. Ultimately, Humza Yousaf ignored that suggestion and was called a pet poodle by Salmond, who went on to say, "I don't think he knew if he was meant to be upset that the stone was leaving Scotland or pleased it was to take such an important part in the ceremony. But the opportunity was there to make a simple statement in defense of the country in the realm, and I'm sure it would have commanded worldwide attention." The stone arrived in Westminster Abbey on 29 April and was placed once again in the coronation stone, as if no bubbling sentiment of Scottish independence existed at all. So, there we go. The many symbols and traditions wrapped up in the coronation tie directly into some incredibly significant stories and issues within the UK itself. We have gems that call back to violent colonial pasts of the British Empire and how we negotiate those or not. A YouGov poll in 2019 reported that 32% of the UK public believed that the British Empire was something to be proud of, and 37% said that it was something to not be proud or ashamed of. In that same survey, 1 in 3 believed that the countries that were colonized by the UK were better off now because of it. This is down, though, I guess, from the 2016 poll where 44% believed that the empire was something to be proud of. Yay. It's still a opinion. Kemi Badenoch, the Minister for Women and Equalities, said that UK citizens need to be taught about all of the good things that the empire and missionaries did, not just focus on the negatives. In 2021, she said that she did not care about colonialism, that inequality already existed in Africa before Europeans carved it up into their empires, and the only Africans who suffered were old elites, not everyday people. Well, I guess nobody told the Mau Mau that, or all those women and children that Consul George Annesley had sexually assaulted or shot, that they were filthy elites, huh? Scottish nationalism is still a strong force that can't be dismissed with a, "No, you can't vote again," and it can't be assumed that the Scottish public would see old connections to the monarchy as above their own personal concerns for their future. Find Out Now poll from in both January and in March of 2023 reported that 54 and 52% respectively of those surveyed would vote yes on an independence referendum, while others since the death of Elizabeth II have reported percents in the mid 40s to the mid 50s. The image of the monarchy has become far less popular than when Elizabeth was alive. According to the most recent data from YouGov, the UK-based data analytics firm, Charles has an overall popularity of 55%, meaning that just a little bit over, half the adult population of the United Kingdom has a positive view of the monarch. Among baby boomers, this rate is 71%, while among millennials, that figure drops down to about 43%. According to the Ipsos group, the royal family has seen its unfavorability rising to 26% and favorability dropping below 50% in March 2023. And a full quarter of the British public give the monarchy a resounding meh. It's not really the most auspicious starts of a new royal chapter. Even economic reasons to support the monarchy and the coronation sound like a bunch of Over half the UK public believed that Charles should have paid for his own coronation with all the money that he has, while less than a third, 32%, said that it should be paid with all of the UK public tax dollars. And all the while, the arguments that are made of a positive economic impact that the royal family and celebrations of them has through tourism, they don't really add up. The National Tourism Authority of the UK, Visit Britain, estimated that Elizabeth's final jubilee brought in £1.2 billion into the economy over a 4-day period. Most of that was generated through domestic tourists, not international. So that's already not bringing in new money. It's just moving around money that was already in the country. And meanwhile, the government reported in 2022 that an extra bank holiday in the United Kingdom would cost the UK economy £1.36 billion. Last time I checked, that's more money. Research actually shows that even in a massive event like a World Cup or a coronation, that even if it doesn't send locals away, that the benefits, the economic benefits to these are often non-existent or incredibly short-lived. Despite Visit Britain's claim that the monarchy brings in over £500 million in tourism, that's not actually an estimate that we can safely make, let alone compare it to how much the country might lose by not having them. Tourists come to the United Kingdom for a lot of reasons. And in 2019, the Tower of London had around 3 million visitors compared to Buckingham Palace that had 500,000. And sure, yeah, Buckingham Palace is not open all year long, but still. The British Museum, Tate Modern, and National Gallery all had over 6 million visitors that same year. So while the royal family might be a fun selling point, people aren't coming to the UK with the sole intention of seeing them. Lots of people are coming to see their stolen cultural heritage. The monarchy doesn't enjoy the popularity that it did with Elizabeth, and social forces that are working within the UK, Europe, and across the world all have an impact on the future of that institution. Half of the countries that make up the Commonwealth realms are considering abandoning Charles as their head of state. The royal family's financials have come under more scrutiny, which hasn't pleased too many people, especially not in the current financial climate. Worsening economic situations and continued disputes over the tiny issue of Ireland's open borders, part of the Good Friday agreements, which is being obstructed by Northern Ireland's right-wing Democratic Unionist Party, are not going to go away or be put on hold just because there's a new king. And little gestures like recycling crowns and cruelty-free chrism aren't the acts of some woke agenda. It's honestly a bit laughable that an institution like the British Monarchy could be seen as anything but an emblem of conservative power. These ceremonies tell us that clearly enough. We might see small changes in opinion towards lampreys and civets, but on everything else, it's just business as usual. The monarchy and royals will try to hold on to what they view as their God-given rights, their coinurs, their Scotlands. It points to the decision that the UK is really facing to change into something new and survive, maybe even thrive, or to pretend that everything's fine and watch it all crumble down. Thank you very much for watching this video. Feel free to leave comments below, and if you liked it or found it interesting, please give us a thumbs up. If you didn't, I guess give us a thumbs down. If you'd like to hear more from me, please hit subscribe. At any rate, I will catch you Archaeophiends next time.